Good evening, everyone. My name is Alok Shirsagar. It's a great privilege to be on this panel and in this audience with you. Thank you, Inakshi and Shreya, for the introduction. And Amrita, it's no wonder that you're an Asia Society Fellow with those very thoughtful, provocative, and insightful questions that we do actually need to address if we are to achieve the underlying objective of inclusive growth. What I'd like to do today is to spend a few minutes articulating a few of the themes in the work that we had the chance to develop together with a number of stakeholders across the country over the last year. Inakshi referred to some of it, but I'll try and talk about some of the themes from that. And then I'll try and request my fellow panelists to really bring to life the actions that they're taking in their own companies, in their own arenas, in the organizations that they lead towards this theme of inclusive growth. First and foremost, from our perspective, we really do think this is India's century. And this is not a slogan. It is not about, the theme in and of itself. But the fact of all of the opportunities that we have as a country, and the fact that we are in the process of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into empowerment, into income, and if we are able to do this in a sustainable and inclusive way, we will be really the beacon for the world. And maybe underneath, what you might hear of as the broad demographic trends are some pretty stark opportunities for us that have got nothing to do with geopolitics or what might be, the topic of the day, but more fundamental opportunities for our country, where, as I'll talk about, this is really our use it or lose it decade. Right? If we really want to capture the opportunities ahead. So we are already about 20% of the world's workforce is in India. 20% of the world's workforce. If you look at the world's skilled workforce in the next 10 years, skilled by mean doctors, engineers, technology people, we will be north of 30% of the world's workforce will be Indian. Right? Just think about that for a minute, in terms of the opportunities that will create for income and jobs in this country. Why is that the case? Of course, because the rest of the world is aging, and many of the people who are young today, primarily in the Middle East and Africa, don't yet have the same set of skills that are currently possible in India. So the first major opportunity is we can and should be the talent factory for the world. Similar to the way in which IT services really drove value, and I'm sure Sajid will talk about the export value of this in the last 25 years. If you look out over the next 25 years, our ability to deliver remote healthcare, for example, sitting in India to elderly people in Japan or Europe, that will be a new set of services that we're able to deliver. You're building large electric vehicle networks. The sensors and the data of all of that will be managed here. You've already got globally tens of thousands of wind turbines and renewable energy platforms, the data and technology for which is managed out of India. So there is an enormous fundamental opportunity that comes from 20% of the world's workforce and 30% of the world's skilled workforce that comes from India. And that is already creating a huge number of new jobs, if you think about 5G and internet-related opportunities, but even more so as the rest of the world ages and will need the sort of remote healthcare and other analytic services that only you can do out of India. That's number one. Number two, we do think that there is a number of manufacturing supply chains that are naturally present in India. Again, not just because of China plus one, but if you look into automotive, if you look into farm machinery, you look into agri and food processing, you look into aspects of specialty chemicals. These are all places where India has natural advantages. And we expect to have several $1 trillion, at least $1 trillion over the next 10 years, move to India because of the natural supply chain advantages between our talent, our natural resources, and of course the supportive infrastructure and incentives that we have. So there is a fundamental opportunity for jobs and growth coming out of that as those companies build out their own supply chains and distribution chains in India to support what they have to export to the world. And the third aspect is, of course, our digital economy. Today, you already have, of course, 650 million internet subscribers, but perhaps those of us who are teenagers might relate to this. But on average, Indians spend 5 to 7 hours a day on their phone, right? By the way, our daughter might be double that, but regardless, right? 5 to 7 hours a day on the phone. And if you look at what is it they're doing today, it's consuming content, right? If you look at Google revenues in India from advertising are up 10x in the last 7 years. 10x. Same is true for Facebook. This is because people are consuming things on YouTube and on Instagram and other short video platforms that often have 100 million daily active users, by the way. Right? I'm sure Sachinji will talk about this later, but it'd be nice to have fintechs that have 100 million daily active users. Today we have content platforms that have that. Our big opportunity as a country is how do we move content to commerce? Because just like you have 650 million people with 5 to 7 hours a day, there's only 15 million, 15 million active e-commerce users in any given month. Only 15 million. Of all the small businesses we have, less than 5 million have even registered to sell on an e-commerce platform. Right? We have about 60 million small businesses. So there's a huge opportunity that we have the underlying mobile phone infrastructure. We will soon have the second largest 5G deployment in the world in 12 months. But today it is all passive content viewing. Our opportunity is how do we move that content to commerce, which will then fundamentally help create lots of new jobs, lots of new income opportunities for entrepreneurs, and as a result of which, enable us to leapfrog the need to create a huge amount of physical distribution infrastructure and otherwise. I'll give you one other point on that just to make it come alive, is you see the influence of regional language and vernacular in this context. Right? If you now see on short video platforms, a dialect of Odia will have an influencer with more than 1 million followers. More than 1 million followers. So our ability in this country to take that time spent on content and move it to commerce through platforms like the Open Network Digital Commerce Network or other aspects like this will be a crucial aspect of how we operate over the next 10 years. So in short, you can look at India and say, why is this India's century? It is India's century because we are 30% of the world's skills force. We are the natural destination for several manufacturing supply chains that take advantage of our technology and our resources. And we have already moved a vast number of people to consuming content on a digital platform. Our opportunity is to move that content into commerce over the next 10 years. In this context, there are huge innovations already underway. Right? I'm sure many of our panelists will talk about this, where companies are already innovating their way because they recognize in India there are no trade-offs. We must have growth that is sustainable and inclusive, because only if we lift hundreds of millions of people and increase their per capita income, that is the only way in which we're going to get the ability to have consumers for all of the products and services. In India, we must have this to be sustainable as well, because the largest number of heat zones in the world are in India. We have the biggest problem with respect to water and soil. So for companies operating in India, whether you're big or small, or for investors who are looking at India, they are looking at this as genuinely a new way of driving jobs and income, which by definition has to be both sustainable and inclusive. And if you look at the growth that's already come out of just the two-wheeler and three-wheeler electric vehicle ecosystem, or the charging infrastructure, or renewable power, these are hundreds, tens of thousands of jobs that were simply not there 3 to 4 years ago. So there are opportunities at every stage where for us, it's not about some ESG report that you present in a conference. It is fundamentally good for business when you're able to drive business models that are sustainable and inclusive. The last couple of points I'll make is there are real challenges we have to overcome. And I don't think this is a straight line, right? And nor is it a God-given right that sometimes people assume that if we just sit back and, the tailwinds will lift all boats. It's absolutely not the case. Right? We have several challenges that we need to overcome as a country, and the private sector has an important and responsible role to address this. The number one issue is inequality. There's huge inequality at a state level. Just to give you a stark example, the per capita income in Karnataka is 10x that of Bihar. 10x that of Bihar. With delimitation and other political changes planned, that difference between political power that comes from Lok Sabha seats in the north and the northeast with a young population, which has a tenth of the average income of an older and wealthier south of the country, is something that we have to address. Otherwise, this will be a major problem going forward. None of these opportunities get addressed unless we find a way to create growth and jobs and income in the north and northeast of the country, because we cannot solve this by migration. It has to be solved, and I'm optimistic about this. We do see lots of entrepreneurs operating and creating excellent quality jobs in food processing, logistics, agriculture, manufacturing in parts of the north and northeast, but there is a real challenge, and we cannot be blind to that the private sector has to help address inequality both at income levels within a state, but also in how we help invest in the north and the northeast to be able to lift young people there and create this sort of opportunities. That's one big issue. Second big issue that we need to address as a country is the ability for us to create high quality governance that generates returns for investors. The reality is we need foreign equity capital, right? There isn't enough savings that moves into equity capital. Sajid will know this better than me, but there's about 600 billion of foreign equity capital we need to be able to fund the growth that we have, right? Extremely high quality reputed companies like the one that Hemant would represent are of course great beneficiaries when people look for well-governed companies that they want to invest behind. But we need many hundreds of companies that have high quality governance and stable operating models so that foreign investors are willing to come in and put money into this country with a 10 or 15 year view. This is not going to be driven by an individual political party in power. This is over a 10 or 15 year period of time. And the private sector has to look at the way in which you improve governance in order to be able to attract long-term investors. That will then fuel the rest of the investments we talked about. And the third challenge we face is really one around climate change, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not really a choice but an imperative given the challenges we already see in our water table, in our soil quality, in the access, frankly, to food and nutrition. And these are the issues that we have to solve as the private sector. And I think the opportunity we have, and I see this in many companies here, and to Amrita's question about profit, right? The reality is companies who are taking a view of how do I create value in this country recognize that this is actually not about the short-term profit imperative. If you do build the next generation of consumers, if you are creating income earning opportunities, if we're doing it in a way that is well governed, that attracts investors into your companies, and you're doing it in a way that recognizes the realities of climate change and therefore the business models that have to be sustainable to start with, you are seeing companies, many of them represented here, that are creating enormous value because of that. So in India, I would just end by saying that for us, this is not a series of choices. It's not, are we inclusive or do we drive growth? Is this the government's issue or is it the company's issue? Right? It is a collective opportunity. It's really once in a lifetime, right? It is India's century, but it needs a very different way of acting to be able to take full advantage of all that we have. So what I'm going to suggest for the rest of this panel is I'm going to request my panelists, maybe starting with you, Hemant, to talk first and foremost about what are the actions you are seeing or the opportunities you're seeing on the ground to both address the opportunities as well as the challenges we talked about.
I'll just pick up, Alok, your point on water, because for us, water becomes a very key area. Agriculture consumes 90% of the water in the country. So obviously, the policy framework currently, and I'll talk more that as you circulate around, policy framework is water is free. So all the farmers are using means of water which is not very sustainable, which is to use flood irrigation, whereas we in Mahindra have a company called EPC where we are using micro irrigation. So that obviously then kind of brings in a factor of inclusivity where we are not looking at this as something to be done as ESG, but for us it is business. And this kind of lifts the whole rural incomes up, because for a plant, feeding 4 liters of water for 2 hours is very different from feeding 2 liters of water for 4 hours. It is not the two are not the same thing. So what I'm trying to say is that if we have to look at rural folks to be having inclusive growth, we have to ensure that they have sustainable ways of making a living. And that will happen. You said 20% of the workforce is actually in India, and 2/3 of that is actually rural workforce. So how do we engage them in a way where they have sustainable employment, and we cannot overlook the impact of agriculture in that? Because 51% of the total skilled workforce or unskilled workforce in the country is employed in agriculture. And this is where we come in, and we believe that water is a very critical resource. Somehow the policy framework is water is free, the electricity to drought, water is free. So since everything is free, it is being misused. And if we can work with our stakeholders in the rural areas on how do we incentivize them and give them means to use water properly, that would be a big factor to make sure that rural households have sustainable means of making a living. You know the work that we are doing on mechanization. That's our bread and butter. Mahindra is the world's largest tractor company by volume. So other than tractors, we do a lot of mechanization, and I think that's very key to understand that even though India is the world's largest producer of wheat and the second largest for rice and for sugarcane, but in terms of yield per hectare, we are very small. In India, we get 3.9 tons per hectare as an average output. In China, it is 6.9 tons per hectare. So we are nowhere close to where we should be. So what can we do to increase mechanization in that respect? We recently launched something called a rice transplanter. If you have traveled in villages, you would see one of the most difficult ways of farming is paddy planting. You would see women folks stand for hours in knee-deep water planting saplings. And we introduced this product called rice transplanters, but it is, in India last year, the total industry was less than 3,000 rice transplanters. In China, it is 100,000 every year. So we have so much more to do in terms of ensuring that there is sustainable livelihood in rural areas that sometimes I believe that we have just even started, and there is so much to be done on that side.
Thank you, Hemant. I think you raised an important point which we'll come to later as well, which is mechanization is a hugely important part of inclusivity, because those women that are doing those jobs are therefore not, unfortunately, getting the skills or able to be their own self-employed entrepreneurs, because they're doing those for many hours, and that leads to lots of health issues as well. So it's a good example of the discussion Amrita was raising, which is you would make more profit by selling more rice transplanters, but fundamentally enabling more women in rural India to free themselves out from the drudgery of that and the dangers of that to be able to expand beyond. Sajid, we're going this way, but I will maybe ask you to spend a bit more from a global investor perspective. At JP Morgan, you spent a lot of time talking about why India And I think in the context of that, maybe talk a little bit about the last 10 years and the next 10.
Thanks, Alok. I have the good fortune of being surrounded by practitioners with their feet firmly on the ground, so I can afford to be abstract and float in the clouds for a bit. No, I think, Alok, some of this may sound obvious, but I think needs repetition, right? Why is there so much excitement towards India? Because there are, I think, a combination of 4 innate, inherent structural features that are very hard to replicate around the world. You spoke a lot about demography, but I think it's important to underscore that point, that in a world with rapidly aging populations, where the working force is contracting from Japan to China, soon in the Europe and the US, you can't overstate the value of a young, skilled population. And this is not some abstract thing in the future. Just look back at what happened in the last 3 years. Everybody's very focused on China plus one in manufacturing, right? But for me, the real revelation happened on the services front, and you alluded to that. Our gross services exports 4 years ago used to be $200 billion. In a matter of 4 years, we've gone from 200 billion to 330 billion in the pandemic. How did this happen? Because A, technology is moving so rapidly that services that we all thought were non-tradable are now very tradable. You pointed to the doctor sitting here and advising patients in Japan. A whole suite of services are now tradable. B, when there was this scarcity and shortage of workers in the heat of the pandemic in 2020, 2021, in Europe and the US, labor force participation was low. People were sitting with excess savings at home. Wages were higher. Companies were scrambling to find workers around the world. And lo and behold, India was there. JP Morgan now has 55,000 people sitting in India, right? Most of our global research, all of our technology, cybersecurity, legal, accounting, card structuring, all happens over here. You've seen hundreds of companies now migrate to that. So this is very real, that given the fact that services are tradable, you don't have to go through the toxicity of immigration and moving there. In the next 20 years, as the world consumes more services, this can be catered to remotely by skilled Indians sitting in India. So I think that's number one. Number two, just the deep entrepreneurial base that India has. How does growth happen? Growth happens when you have more workers that join the labor force. At some point you run out of that. It happens when you've got more capital deepening. You give more capital per worker. At some point you run out of that as well, as China is finding out. And then it happens by this mysterious thing that we economists call TFP, total factor productivity. Essentially it's innovation. And so to the extent that you've got this deep, innovative, entrepreneurial base, it kind of guarantees you that the runway for growth is going to be longer than just the demographic dividend and capital intensity. Right? The third factor, I think, is, and this can't be overstated or understated, is just, it's more macro, but bear with me, it's just high savings rate. Latin America struggles with high potential growth rate because their savings rates are in the teens. India, even in the last few years, savings rates have fallen, is still 30% of GDP. What that allows you to do is have high rates of investment, 32, 33%, without growing your current account deficit. And when your investment rate is 32, 33%, then your potential growth rate is 6, 7, and even higher, right? So now you've got this young population. I'll talk about the challenges in a second. You've got a deep entrepreneurial base, and you've got a high savings rate. And the combination of those three is very hard to replicate around the world. The last thing I'll say is just, I think, the incentive compatibility of politics and economics. And I think, the technology and the smartphone have meant that these information asymmetries have broken down. The base of the pyramid is very, very aspirational, right? When we grew up, there were, 2 cars in India, there was 1 bicycle, BSA, SLR. But now people at the bottom can see the promised land and want to get there in a hurry. And that's, I think, exerting enormous pressure on policymakers from the bottom. There's a great study that Milan Vaishnav in Washington, D.C. has done. You know Milan well, where in the 80s and 90s, there was this perverse outcome where political outcomes and economic outcomes were inversely correlated. At a state level, the worst performing states got re-elected the most often. In the last 20 years, it's completely changed. You've got this alignment of politics and economics where high-performing states are being re-elected repeatedly because of the pressure from the bottom. So I think these 4 things are, none of it is new, it's obvious, but when you link them together, you look around the world and say, nobody at this moment in time has it. And then you layer onto that the geopolitical sweet spot that we find ourselves in. But I'll end, Alok, with the important warning that none of this is manna from heaven. You have to work to make this happen. Two things keep me awake at night. One is, this demographic dividend is all very well, but you have to create jobs. India has shown that we can create white-collar jobs. But a lot of people coming into the labor force in the next 20 years will be blue-collar workers. And in a world where the cost of capital fell so much, you've got so much automation, capital intensity is increasing, it's not going to be easy to create millions and millions of blue-collar jobs, right? Which is critical for this model holding. The last thing I'll say is, no country without natural endowment, like Saudi Arabia, for example, has grown at 7 or 8% for decades on end, like we need to, without strong export growth. There just isn't any example in the last 100 years. So we should not pretend that we can close ourselves to the world and grow at 7 or 8%. It'll have to be driven by exports. Between 2002 and 2010, we grew at almost 9%. Exports was front and center. Exports grew 18% a year in real terms every year for a decade, right? Now the issue is, back then was the period of hyper-globalization, right? This was the magical period of globalization. You plugged into the global engine and you grew. Now we're in this strange world where you've got more protectionism, more deglobalization, more economic balkanization, for all the reasons we know. So to grow exports in this global environment is going to be challenging. And it'll mean having to increase your market share, because the pie may not grow very much. And that means being very, very competitive, and comes back to all the things that you alluded to. So lots of potential, but real challenges that we need to overcome.
No, thank you, Sajid. I think I just underscore a couple of things before we move on, which is, there is real change already underway. That 200 billion to 330 billion in services exports is a real example of exports, right? We see this also when you look at new energy sources, right? Hydrogen. You look at new analytics services. The challenge, exactly to your point, Sajid, is this is all for highly skilled people, right? How do we make sure that the benefits go through and increase per capita income? When we looked at this, for example, in the city of Mumbai, unless you get to at least 20,000 rupees a month, right, you're not really sustainable in this city, right? In this city. So unless we start to take a view not of macro growth, but per capita income, and the jobs may not be big company jobs. A lot of them will be entrepreneurs in the supply chain, in the transporters.
The SMEs that create most of the jobs, right?
Those are where the jobs are. But those jobs need to be able to create that level of income if we're able to be sustainable. Shinjini, you have a unique perspective. Not only are you an entrepreneur, but you've been a regulator. You've also built many successful businesses. As you listen to the opportunities ahead and what you're now doing at Salt, can you talk about what you see ahead and what are you doing about it?
Sure. So I don't know how many people here saw this 90s film called Mr. India, because there are a few non-Indians in the crowd. So what happens in the film is that this man finds, he becomes invisible. And the only way to see him is to wear a certain pair of glasses or wear a watch or something like that. There are many films on that theme. I'm like that person who has found those glasses, because all my life, 30 years of financial services, being a regulator, large American banks, multinationals, I pretended to be the person who was same as everybody else in the room. And then I found those glasses, and suddenly now I can see the invisible women everywhere. So I'm going to just pull that into the discussion and talk about everything that both of you talked about, but just put a little bit of that gender lens to it. And so basically my introduction is that I'm building a company called MySalt, which is a fintech platform for women. And the inspiration for that came from my co-founder, but also because we realized that a lot of new technology, so financial services is changing very fast. It's one of the core themes in your report, and it's one of the pillars on which we hope to drive the growth of this country. But what is happening in financial services is that if you see, the participation of women across products has not grown, okay? So traditional financial services we always thought had problems, But when new financial services started, when fintech started, we automatically assumed that technology solves problem, because if you think about it, every woman also has a smartphone, the same smartphone. She's also spending the same 5 hours on her phone. I'm not talking about the microfinance population, because that's a problem that required a different approach, has been taken and has been to a very different degree solved. But we are talking about all other women. Now, the statistics are that India has more women graduating in STEM subjects than US, Canada, as a percentage. Okay, so our percentages are very healthy. We have 29% class participation from women in STEM subjects, because we all want our Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. We all want our daughters to be equal to men. We give them the opportunity, they end up there. And so the participation is high. But then what ends up, we actually in our postgraduate classes, we have 51% women and 49% men. But what ends up happening is that workforce participation of women, as you know, is a consistently falling trend in India, and we are right now at some 19% or something. So what are these women doing? So the reason that we started this company was to understand that what is women's participation looking like and why is it so low. We did like a lot of work on our own, because primarily there's not much research, etc. And what we realized is that there are a few things that have happened which are very encouraging. So I'll come back to the positive part of this story. The positive part of this story is that there's a lot more education. There's a lot more inheritance. So inequality cannot be addressed on a flow approach, because going forward, if you do something, you cannot address historical inequalities. But here's a situation where the stock is changing, because there are more single daughters or two daughters, and they're inheriting more wealth. So there is a population of women that are much more into that wealth. Also, inheritance laws are changing. Various states have various, stamp duty provisions, etc. So there's a significant impact of that, which we see on a compounding basis going forward will have a positive impact. But the second thing that's also there is that the nature of work has changed. So what Sajid referred to is there is such a massive shift in nature of work. And much of that is to the advantage of the woman, because you find that some woman sitting in Madhya Pradesh is working for a multinational company and earning in dollars. And you do find more and more examples of that. So women are not necessarily may not be a part of the employment, but they're very much a part of the earning. So they do have, apart from household money, they also have independent source of income. And this gig economy, this access to the internet, access to Instagram, access to various things, is definitely creating access to money. So those are the positive trends that I do think that we have a huge opportunity to build upon. Again, same things that all of them said, I don't want to repeat, but access to data, access to a different type of work, and therefore we do see that market will also grow. And it's very important for that market to grow, because we are talking about 50% of the population, and therefore, and a percentage of the population that is well educated and that is capable of doing things. So whether it is financial services, whether it is work itself, both ways you are able to get something good out of this population. Just one more thing I'll say, that the issue, when you talk about women, the other important thing to bear in mind is geography. So we are a very large country, and I had never really thought about this, but if you think about it, women actually tend to migrate, more men migrate for work, and more women migrate for marriage. So what ends up happening is that men migration is related to talent. So if you see men migrating from eastern part of the country to southern part of the country or western part of the country, it's because there are jobs here, there's labor there. So it's labor capital. But when you see women, it's a very distributed pattern, because a girl from Ludhiana will get married into Raipur, a girl from Odisha may get married into Mumbai. So you see, women, talented women, educated women migrating across. And what that does is then, this inequality historically that we've always had, that tier 2, tier 3 cities have a different pace of growth, a different rate of growth, a different rate of investment, a different rate of skilling. I think we have an opportunity, and some of this is happening already, is closing that gap. And that also gives a major boost to the, you talked about regional disparity, and you talked about scratching the surface and just finding so much to do. And I'm right now in that state where whatever you feel that you can scratch and find, you can find a market for personal finance, you can find a market for credit, you can find a market for insurance, you can find a market for pretty much everything, every type of product that you're talking about, small businesses, So that I think from my perspective is looking good.
Look, I just wanted to pick up the point what Srini raised, that the women participation in workforce. And I have seen how things have changed in the last 10 to 12 years. This is in 2010, and I was running the manufacturing operations for our auto business. And we have an engine plant in Igatpuri. And we were expanding, and there were a need to recruit about 500 new jobs into the plant. And union approached me, the workmen union, that out of the 500 people, can you take 100 workmen's son? And they negotiated very hard with me on 100, 110, those kind of numbers. And I told them that, why are you talking 100? I will take 200 if you give me workmen daughters. And none of them came forward. Not even a single guy came forward that we will get our daughters to work in the plant and they can get employed here. Cut to 2023, we have many of our plants which are 100% manned by women now. We have a full shop of Excel in Nagpur, 100% manned by women. So I think things have changed a lot in front of, I have seen this change, and I'm sure you would be seeing that change, that how the attitudes in the society are changing. And sometimes I have seen businesses cannot do things till the society is ready. It's all coming together. And this is the optimism I think I see now when I look out.
Well, thank you, Hemant. A lot of that optimism is grounded in the work that Antarang and other organizations like you do, Priya. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the work that you do, and what do you see, therefore, in terms of how we build skills and capabilities for employability for more of Hemant's plants.
Thanks, Alok. So I'm going to take sort of the contrarian view over here and look at the other side of, what the three of you have spoken about and what you've also alluded to, though quite a bit, right? Who is this sort of growth working for? And that's a question that we asked ourselves. Antarang works in 25 districts in India with state governments and ensures that careers education, career exposure, and school to work informed aspirational school to work transition is a reality for the millions of children in government schools. So that's the work that we do. We enable these aspirational school to work transitions. So today, if you really unpack who India's growth has really worked for, you yourself spoke about the kind of services that are being exported, where it went from 200 to 350 billion, right? You're talking about growth in sectors like banking and financial services, professional services, or media and entertainment, all of which it completely excludes young people from the bottom of the pyramid, right? It really does not include all of those young people for whom the only narrative up until now has been skills which are fairly stereotypical and sort of doesn't really get them to these kind of sectors where growth has been turbocharged. So that's number one. So that's sort of the inequity or the imbalance that organizations like us and the kind of work that today the government is also enabling is really trying to change. That's number one. Second, you spoke about the geographical disparity that is there. Beyond, within a state itself, if you look at UP as a state, right, the way Western UP behaves and Eastern UP behaves is very, very different. So how do you how do you ensure that local economies are activated? How do you ensure that industry in very, very localized contexts are also contributing to economic progress and social progress over there? So the way, again, the way that we've done it and the way that you can see it happening in rural India as well and in urban India is also, how do you get industry to really put their skin in the game in many ways and make sure that young people get the kind of exposure that is required, right? With the changing nature of the economy today, my children who go to privileged schools, it's not transferable skills are very easy for them. So even if the nature of work changes, it's very easy for them to sort of switch. But the kind of skilling that the general narratives of skilling that's provided is very, very narrow. We spoke about blue collar workers, but unfortunately what we we saw even through the pandemic was that the nature of blue-collar jobs changed so completely that a majority of the population could not keep up with it. So how do you sort of build some of these core skills, core transferable skills in young people through the education system itself, right? So, and then how do you get local economy to make sure that there are exposure visits that are given, local industries come and talk to them about what they do. There is the NAPS, that is already the National Apprenticeship Promotion Scheme. There are some fantastic policies that are there on paper. But if you look at the National Apprenticeship Promotion Scheme, in the last year, for example, about 45,000 industries participated. There are 97 lakh industries which are registered on the Udyam portal, right? Even if each one of them takes in one apprentice, right, the 70 lakh unemployed population of the country today, you are solving the problem. So there are all of these policies that are there on paper, but you need to be able to energize them. And that's something that we've been pushing for consistently, to say that, hey, can we really energize some of this? Finally, it's representation. I mean, even over here, it was great to see Amrita kicking us off, and rarely happens, but it's generally a triad of, government, industry and industry associations. But can you make it a hexagon? Ensure that there's representation of education, because they sort of lay the foundation for all kinds of skilled workforce, right? Whatever workforce that's there, can you really have educationists on the same table? Can you have people like me? And I'm so glad that, Asia Society and Alok, you sort of ensured that this representation is there, because there are organizations like ours, large organizations like ours, which are actually doing that last mile delivery of many of these services and many of these policies that are there on the ground. And finally, can you ensure that young people, for whom a lot of these policies are targeted, and we're talking about 30% of the population, their representation definitely needs to be there. I think those are, these are sort of three things, representation, making sure that representation is there. Second, having industry put skin in the game, hiring more apprentices, making sure that there's a pipeline of, highly skilled, highly engaged workforce. And finally, making sure that it's equitable sort of growth, right? Transferable, great core employability skills given at the high school level itself.
Thank you, Priya.
I'll just take 10 seconds. No, you raised such great points. When we talk about, growth here, think of the structural transformation that all economies of India's per capita income have to go through, right? So when we say 6-7% growth, what we're really saying is we've got to take people out of agriculture into higher value added, more productive, manufacturing and services. Now, let's just all stipulate that the government can't do this. India offers a wonderful natural experiment, right, where we had state-led growth from 1950 to 1990, and we saw the consequence was 3.5% growth for 40 years. And then you, in 1991 and thereafter, unleashed the dynamism of the private sector, and through all of the crisis and wars and droughts, we've grown almost 7% for 30 years. So this has to be private sector-led. But what the state can do and what policy can do, I think, is to ensure that the incentives and the prices that the private sector faces, right, in terms of labor versus capital, is not misaligned. Right? So I'm just talking in the abstract. If you have a situation where capital is subsidized, either because real interest rates are too low or you're giving accelerated depreciation to capital, then the private sector will skew towards becoming more capital intensive, as we are seeing in many parts of the world. If you are going to reduce the cost of labor, which is another way of saying provide more education, provide more skilling, take away some of the frictions which makes it harder for business to replace labor with capital, right? Then you will change the incentive of the private sector. So I think that's something we have to think through very carefully. I'll end with this sobering note, Alok, which is every industrial revolution has resulted in a greater share of output going to capital versus labor. We're in the midst of another industrial revolution, a technological revolution. And so countries around the world have to be very, very careful that that historical precedent is not accentuated, that labor gets an adequate share of the revolution that's undergoing. And let's not pretend that even, so the blue-collar job creation is imperative, but let's not pretend even white-collar jobs are safe, because service exports are all very well. But we know what the China shock did to the parts of America. It hollowed out blue-collar jobs there. Think of what a ChatGPT shock can do to white-collar workers around the world, right? That you have to be skilled and educated to the point where technology becomes a complement, not a substitute. So these are daunting challenges that I think face the world in the next 20, 30 years.
Well, absolutely, and I think you can already see it's a pretty energized panel, and we're going to get to questions in a minute. But I want to talk about something that all of you touched upon, which is none of us can do this by ourselves. Right? A company can't do it by itself, Antarang can't do it by itself, a state government can't do it itself, and an entrepreneur can't do it by themselves. I think it's worthwhile to reflect, therefore, on what are some things that have actually worked in India over the last 5 or 7 years, and both at the central and the state government, which perhaps we don't talk enough about, right? How many of you in this room have used your digital payment app today? Who's used UPI today? How many of you have heard of a company called NPCI? Does anyone want to spell what NPCI stands for? Now, the underlying mechanism that has enabled the incredible innovation of digital payments in India is the National Payments Corporation of India. And this was birthed in the RBI, as you know, Shinjini, and has spun out as a separate company. And it's a unique private and public company where at least half the board of directors come from the private sector. They are setting the standards for the protocols, the technology, and the infrastructure for UPI that has enabled a huge amount of innovation in digital payments, which in turn is enabling innovation on credit and insurance. And going back to inclusivity, this is what has removed a huge amount of corruption that was there, for example, in direct benefits payments, in the ability for women to take charge of their own finances, because you now have it on your phone and are able to do this. Our success in renewable energy came from another organization that perhaps is not even as known as NPCI. It's actually called the Solar Energy Corporation of India. And one of the things they did about 8 years ago is to standardize contracts for solar and wind. Because you standardize contracts, it became a lot more bankable and you could get global investors to participate. And you created a much more transparent auction-based system of allocating solar and wind rather than a crony capitalist view that was in the past highly politically driven, right? So there is an importance. Right now, for example, there's a big thrust on democratizing digital commerce through creating standard protocols for digital commerce through ONDC, similar to what we've seen on the digital payment side. So I think in the world that we operate in, Sajid and Priya, to the point you made, there is an aspect here about what can we do in India where we create these sorts of technology platforms, common protocols, rules of the road, right? A lot of our infrastructure, for example, the roads infrastructure, has come again because we have standard contracts and standard auctions with the toll operate transfer and other mechanisms that again have encouraged more transparent allocation of resources and more investments into the road sector, which in turn have created more income for the farmers because they're able to more easily get to the mandi to get better yield on their crops. So I do think in the discussion, which we often don't talk about, is institutional mechanisms matter, right? The ability to have a common entrance exam for medical colleges, NEET as an example. The ability to have, NPCI, SECI, ONDC, all of these are important ways in which we can translate a policy objective into common technology-led protocols, contracts that then encourage innovation from the private sector. Because you can't otherwise create innovation, right? You're not going to be able to do it without that. Now, with that type of framing in mind, which is that this is not about what a company can do on its own, but what can you do in partnership with, for example, local government. Sarpanches are very important to the work that you do, the government school infrastructure, other private sector companies. Maybe I could just ask Hemant, maybe for you to kick off on this, which is, what are you seeing as the ways in which partnerships on the ground with other stakeholders are driving inclusion and growth for you?
Alok, you are absolutely right. I mean, if I look at inclusiveness from the villages and the rural areas, we can't do much without the local government support to us, which is the sarpanches and the local community leaders that work in. So their role is very critical. And we have seen that in one of the practices that we are trying to promote is internally we call Krish-E, which is basically farming as a service, where we are trying to bring in new practices to the farmers to make sure that they leave any of the old practices which are not helping them improve yield, which they have learned from your fathers, from the grandfathers, and how can we bring more tech in? And I've seen, Alok, you're right that if we were trying to do it sitting in Mumbai, trying to manage that kind of growth, we won't get it. We used a lot of the self-help groups in the villages, a lot of the sarpanches, the local people, which we call community leaders. And once they get with you, then the whole village kind of follows. Currently, we are running 40,000 technique plots, where we have people on the ground who teach the farmers on what are the best practices, how can mechanization help, and trying to create some kind of a data which can then flow in and we can build more products on that. So you are absolutely right. I mean, till the time you have local support with our local on-the-ground dealers and the community leaders, it's very difficult to scale up any business model for that respect.
And Hemant, to the point of inclusive growth, that obviously then fuels demand for your products and services.
Absolutely. I mean, till farmers have more income, there is no way they are going to buy a tractor or any implement for that matter. I mean, they need to be having doubling of the farmer income. Again, I pick up your point. It's not the government job. I mean, this is kind of a rallying point for the government. But it is in our business interest, it is in our kind of interest of the society at large that we are able to give more income to the farmers, which is more sustainable and which is more growth oriented. And only then our businesses will do well, clearly.
I'm just going to move things around a bit. So Shinjini, how are you thinking about partnerships to build out what you're doing with MySalt and beyond?
So, I mean, in the fintech world, partnership is like a huge leverage that you have, because you are in part of an ecosystem where technology is at different stages with different participants, and therefore there's a lot of that synergy, search for that synergy, and it works for everyone. But if you ask me frankly, what attracted me to build a platform which women could use for their wealth creation and creating financial security for themselves, one of the ideas that I've always supported is that you need more women on the supply side, because actually the person who sells and solves for this woman is typically a man, and that creates one of those difficult situations sometimes. And therefore you need to create a private mechanism, you need to create a community, and therefore bringing more and more women into that ecosystem on the supply side. And if we were to create it, we would require a large amount of capital to do that, right? Because you would need to pay that many people, you would need to ensure compliance, etc. So how do we tap into existing ecosystems? So one of the ways that we work is to find existing networks of women and then try and go there and see if we can work with them. But if you ask me very shortly, there are 4 things that I think for us to be successful in general, not just my business, but for more gender inclusivity to be there. One is, the primary requirement is safety. Because I've traveled across, the length and breadth of this country over the last couple of years, and I've realized that the amount of safe space that cities have is directly correlated to how many women you're going to come and see and take charge. It doesn't matter. I mean, schools are very insulated spaces, but beyond that, safety is a major concern. The second is mobility. I've always said that the difference between girls and boys is wheels, and I find that the ability to take safe transport is a major thing. And the third is governance. I think women, the trust breaks much easier, and if a woman buys a handbag that costs some 2,000 rupees, then there's no questions asked. But if she makes an investment and that loses value, then there are 1,000 things to explain. So she chooses to buy the bag, she chooses to buy the gold rather than the financial instrument. So I think governance is a very important thing, that if we have a cleaner system, then there is much better ability to scale. And then capital, of course, because if you do see the skew in capital allocation towards businesses that are for men and for women, and if you can correct that skew even marginally, then you have potential for growth. So in my mind, that partnership is not just a narrow distribution type of partnership, but that partnership has to be like more multifaceted, maybe government sometimes, maybe private sector players sometimes, and capital providers sometimes. So yeah, it has to be seen from all of that.
Priya, sitting in Mumbai, it's very easy to say government schools don't work and all these issues, but you have had incredible impact at Antarang in actually partnering with government schools. So maybe you could share a bit with us what has been your learnings in doing that, what works, what doesn't, because at the end of the day, to what Sajid was saying, when we make the government school system work is when we actually have, high quality people for the economy.
Totally. I think our experience has been that governments want to work, right? Government schools want to create impact. And as they say, and as Shinjini also sort of referred right now, it does take a village. So our work begins at the whole systems level, right? While we work with each of the school heads, we realize that it does take participation of not just the school heads over there, but the teachers, the parents, the education officers, the block officers in each of the rural blocks that we work in, and definitely local industry. I'll take the example of Goa, right? Most of us think of Goa as this really rich state, 4 lakh per annum per capita income. But if you go down to South Goa and go down to some of the schools, even in South Goa, and I'm not even talking about Nagaland, which is another state that we work in, where for a child it takes anywhere between 4 to 5 hours to even get to school sometimes, right? Even in a state like Goa, South Goa, the villages in South Goa, children still do need to travel anywhere between 1 hour to 1.5 hours to reach school. And it's a state where public transport is pretty broken, right? So mobility comes into play over there. There, the partnership is with the state government to ensure that all the schools are bought into ensuring that they're not taking accountability just to ensure that students pass grade 10 and grade 12, right? For all of us, schools take responsibility for pass percentages, but the state government has actually committed to saying that we'll ensure that students will transition to the next stage of, what your report says, enrolling into higher education or finding themselves a job. Now, this will only happen if local industry participates. CII over there has opened their doors, the local small CII partners over there, they've opened their doors to hire students who've passed grade 12 who need to work for economic reasons. They've sort of committed to building their skills and hiring them. So there is a government, industry, parents have been again sort of engaged into this whole system to ensure that children are just not their children are not just looking at hospitality or mining, which are some of the popular sort of occupations over there, but today they're in IT, ITES and all of those services as well. And then teachers have been trained to provide this kind of guidance and careers education. So 630 high school teachers have been trained to provide this. So it is a partnership, and it really does take a village to ensure that this does happen.
Thank you. I'm now going to open up to some questions and then we'll synthesize at the end. Mr. McCly, please.
Hi. Thank you all. Fantastic. Everything, Only one point that you have brought.
Maybe, sir, if you could use the mic, Mr. McCly. It's coming.
Oh, sorry. Thank you all. It was fantastic, One point, though, that remains in my mind, and it's really something Sajid said, which is that as you go forward, capital takes away more. In some senses, that is the nature of capitalism, right? The nature of capitalism is to take everything if there is no regulation. In most cases, there is very inadequate regulation because who makes the rules? The man who pays the piper. So I think that while all of these processes are fantastic, I think we really need to think of some radical way in which we could change that ratio that you were talking about. Do you have any idea, Sajid? Put you on the spot.
No, this is the problem that's as plaguing the West, and much of what we're seeing in the US, for example, is a function of how economic growth was distributed over the last 20 years. I just go back to basics. There were at different levels in different parts of the world subsidies on inadvertently subsidies on capital and taxes on labor, and that meant. Let's go back to after what happened in the global financial crisis. So I've written about this fact that the choice of policy was wrong in the West. Fiscal policy tightened too quickly. Structural fiscal deficits, sorry for being a little abstract here, tightened
He
by
is
10
Dr. Chinoy, by the
No,
way,
no.
so we shouldn't call him by his first name.
tightened by 10% of GDP, right? So fiscal policy choked the recovery around the world after the global financial crisis. These economies, the US, the UK, many parts of Europe, were 10, 15 percentage points below their pre-GFC path, right? And this is when the term secular stagnation came into being. Now, what happened then? When one arm was overly tight, monetary policy became the only game in town. What did that do? Interest rates went to zero, and we saw this gush of liquidity down the world. What did that do? It kept zombie companies alive, right? Productivity growth collapsed because companies that should have disappeared and new companies should have arisen were still alive because the cost of capital was zero. What happens when the cost of capital is zero? Firms became very capital intensive around the world. Who suffered? Labor. So this didn't require any scientific regulation. This just required basic usage of policy to be appropriate. And so I would think a lot of the goals have been self goals in the last 15 years. And I think now what you're seeing around the world, whether it's what President Biden is doing or what the Europeans are doing, is trying to self-correct. And I think there are lessons that India can learn from that. That you have to ensure that the relative prices that the private sector faces in terms of labor and capital are not misaligned. And that happens through policy. The more education and skilling you do, and the less restrictions around labor, the relative price of labor is lower, right? And so, Jamal, I don't think there are any magic bullets or any panacea. I think it's going back to first principles to ensure that that the factors of production are not distorted.
Mr. Mariwala?
I have 2 points. One is that we cannot grow inclusively without the help of state in some or the other way. So what role should the state play, and importantly, what role should the state not play in this matter? That is first question. And second one is what Mr. Sikka raised at point, that for this growth we are going to be requiring a lot of natural resources or common resources such as water, soil and other things like environment. How do we assure equitable access to all of them for the growth? Otherwise, if it's a purely capitalistic society, then whoever can pay can do that. But whereas that kind of disparity in the country is tremendous out here. I'd love to hear your views on that. Thanks.
Let me kick off, and then maybe Hemant, you can add to this from what you've seen on the ground. I think, firstly, I think it's important to define what we mean by state, right? There is what happens in the union government, what happens at the state government, what happens in a local government, and then there are all the regulators, and then there are, of course, all the institutions, right? The NHAIs, the SECIs, the NPCIs, and others. So I think it's a complicated question to say what should the state do, because I think there's a real difference between what each of these people should do. I think when you look at practically what has driven growth in the last 10 years has been sectors in which you've created new entrepreneurs, not oligarchs, but new entrepreneurs, right? And those new entrepreneurs have come where the state has provided infrastructure, particularly roads, ports, and physical infrastructure, where there's been the rules-based digital infrastructure, whether it's on payments or credit. You now see this in mandis, you see this with FASTag, if you're going through toll nakas or other things like that. And it's come where you've had resources allocated on auction basis as opposed to based on your friends and family basis, right? So I think the ability for the state to create an infrastructure, both physical and digital, and rules-based mechanisms is very important to have small and new entrepreneurs create the type of innovations and jobs. Because I think the other point to what Mr. Miklai was saying is returns to capital can also be for smaller entrepreneurs. If they're able to build new businesses, build new distribution hubs, as we've, for example, seen in logistics in the last 3 or 4 years, that in and of itself actually creates a huge number of jobs. The second aspect to your question is what the state should not do is actually try and pick favorites, right? As soon as you're picking favorites in the way in which the rules are set, or you're favoring one type of business group versus the other, you are then going to end up in a big problem. The governing factor for us, at least this is my personal opinion, is that we need external capital. Right? We need external capital. And as you know, as we've seen even in the last few years, every time there is a governance problem, the external capital withdraws. Right? And so the extent to which we continue to need that 600 billion of equity capital from overseas, I think we will continue to have at least some amount of governance to ensure that that balance between what the state does and what the innovators do. Last point, I think, has worked really well in the last several years, both at a state level and at a central level, is the opportunity to create a safety net, right? We do have a nutrition problem, but at least the PDS system is working, the direct benefits transfer system is working. These are, again, things that the government can do that others are not able. But Hemant, you want to maybe spend a little bit of time on that?
Can I just add to your point before we move to the second point? So one of the things that definitely in financial services holds is the state should ideally be responsible for ensuring that the supply side responds to the demand. So we have had a state that has been very focused also on the demand side, right? Like because state gives subsidies, state creates demand, etc. But on the supply side, for example, I'll talk about financial services without going into other things. So infrastructure, roads, other things. But in financial services, for example, this question on whether we have enough number of banks or enough number of service providers for a population that is going to grow at this rate or at this pace is a question that regulators are very unlikely to ask or answer, because you know, regulators are risk managers, and the moment you increase the coverage of something, the risk also increases with that. So it's not natural for that licensing process or that process to automatically take care of it. So there's no demand supply matching that happens by itself in markets that are highly controlled and regulated like our markets. But the governments have a responsibility to ensure. So one of the things that at that point of time we didn't see the merit of, but when this Jan Dhan Yojana program started, and it was quite chaotic, it was actually increasing risk on KYCs. They were like we didn't feel very comfortable about it. But actually when you now see going back and seeing that what did that insistence on having every individual have an account do was to create this massive backbone for NPCI and all the UPI that we now talk about as a success story. And that was a good example of supply side management. And when and if you can extend that analogy to other things like infrastructure, or for me, safety of your assets or people or life or livelihood or livestock, those I think is core to the government's responsibility, right? Arbitration, safety, infrastructure, and providing enough so that supply side can be forecasted to match the demand.
Hemant, if you could just elaborate on his second point, which is how do you...
Just very quickly, I'll share my own experience that, first of all, your point is very valid because it's not good that, if we want to really ensure inclusive growth across the country, it's not right that some people or some corporates go into villages and kind of take more share than what the locals have. I think it's a very fair point. We have done a very large kind of work in Araku Valley. This is a totally Adivasi area with very low level of literacy and very low productivity in agriculture. And we involved all the Adivasis and did a massive scale of reforestation there. And coffee plantation was the big stuff there. 26,000 households were impacted with this, and a lot of cooperatives came out from there. And now we know, and then we also made sure that this coffee is placed at a premium level. So Araku Coffee, the first store started in Paris, now one is in Bangalore. And this is the first fair trade homegrown coffee in the country. And all the money is sitting with the cooperatives there. So this was a very backward area. Some people went in, did all the work with the local folks, and all the benefit stays with the community there. And they are able to now, without need of any middlemen, being able to participate from their crop right down to the very high end of branding, which, of course, we are helping them do that. So I think it is upon us to understand that if we take too much of resources from the local community, of course they are going to react. And that is not good for any societal equitable distribution in that sense.
Other questions? Please, if you could introduce yourself also.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, my name is Jay. Firstly, thank you very much for the evening, for the discussion. I would like to reiterate what you said, that this is India's century. I would like to go further and say this is once in a lifetime opportunity for India. But one thing that I've been trying to wrap my mind around was the question of employability. States and government, for example, they just leave the train when they just leave the train when the person is graduate. For example, I was just reading a fact that the world has created more graduates in the last 30 years than it did in the last 800 years. Around 31% of Korean taxi drivers have a graduate degrees. 15%. I was reading an annual report yesterday which said 15% of high-end security guards in India have a college degree. So now the question is, how do we just not stop the parcel at employment, at education, and move it to employment? What you're doing with Antarang is fabulous, but one thing that I found missing from this discussion was scale. How do we scale this? How do we scale something like an organization who is doing 63 villages? How do we do that to 10,000 villages or 15,000 villages? That's my question.
A small correction. We work in 25 districts, so it's not 63 villages, but in 25 districts. But yeah, you raised an extremely important point, right? So some of these solutions, all of these solutions, because the scale of the problem is so huge, if it's not solving the problem at that same scale or larger, it's useless. So which is why working with the education system and making employability and transition to the next stage of the young person's life becoming their responsibility and accountability is really, really critical. So schools taking accountability to say that, okay, the students that I'm working with, they've not just passed grade 12, they've moved on to the next stage. They've either enrolled into vocational education, higher, today, there are plenty of BVOC courses, right, which are very, very specifically targeted at certain high skill sort of industries as well. So are they enrolling? Have I actually passed the baton on to the next stage? Or if they're working, have they enrolled as apprentices or interns? And there are schemes and policies that are there, right? So the missing link is who takes accountability for it. Currently today, the Ministry of Education does not talk to the Ministry of Skills and skills development, who do not talk to the Ministry of Labour, right? So how do we ensure that the baton is passed from one to the other and ensuring that someone takes accountability for it? And that's the work, that's the hard work that needs to be done, that's connecting the dots.
Other questions, please, from the back there?
Somebody's got the mic.
Just, if you could go to the back there, and then Paula will come to you in a minute. Just, please, yeah. If you could just introduce yourself and ask a question, please.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Stephen. Just thought, I work for the largest oil company in the world. And today, Saudi women are working on the rigs, on offshore oil platforms, onshore platforms. They're working in the fields. So it's very credible if Saudi Arabia can go that far. And their management has ensured their safety, everything. The second thing, I have a building that is just coming up, high rise. I hardly see women working in the construction. It's zero. And another thing which Vivek Ramaswamy talks of highly skilled labor, which he calls indentured skilled labor. Why are we clamoring for those H-1B visas when we have everything at home? Thank you.
Paula, thank you.
Hi, my name is Vibhav. Thanks for a very insightful talk. Just wanted to ask a question. We've talked about the premise of it being India's century. There's a lot of promise over here. But if you look at the history of prosperity and development, stable institutions form the fulcrum and key to actually economic success and bridging inequities. If you look at the way the Indian state's been shaped, it lends itself a lot of discretionary power. Look at the way bill consultations happen nowadays, the way rulemaking has been taken away from, in a lot of cases, has been taken away from the legislature, given back to the executive. How do you find this balance then between creating those enabling conditions that allow something like NPCI to flourish, when at the same time you can shut off the internet or the state can can shut down businesses overnight through raids. What balance is then? How can we, as members of civil society, work to ensure that there are reasonable safeguards to prevent excessive discretionary power while providing those enabling conditions for markets to flourish?
I think it's a very critical point that you've raised, and there's an organization that I've had the privilege to be part of called PRS Legislative Research. Its entire focus is to actually support state and Lok Sabha MPs and MLAs to be more effective in their roles, because there is an imbalance in the checks and balances of our system today, in which all of the things you talked about are very real issues that need to get solved, right? The only thing I would just say is that the extent to which we can continue to have distributed entrepreneurship, right? So today, for example, just to go back right now, just to the physical and digital infrastructure combined, you now have many hundreds of small logistics companies, warehousing companies that are taking a lot of the food processing, all of which are being done now in a way that's a lot more digital and GST compliant, because that's the way they get credit, right? Very different than practices of 15 years ago, right, where there was a lot more cash economy, a lot more who you know in that particular mandi, and a lot more influence of the middlemen. So I think there is a real challenge with respect to the balance between the executive and the legislature, and there is a real challenge on avoiding, this approach of discretionary power. But we have to create more entrepreneurs, and the more distributed those entrepreneurs across states are, right? You see this in the southern states, for example, right? It doesn't really matter what's happening with political power, right? The belt between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu has become the hub of electric vehicle innovation amongst the battery innovation in the world, right? Even though there have been 3 changes of government in the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu in the last 10 years. That's because there are many small entrepreneurs or new entrepreneurs who are participating in that. So there isn't an easy answer, but I think it does depend on more distributed entrepreneurs and a more rules-based system. Other questions, please.
Excuse me. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Do I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Hi.
Good evening.
Hi. So my name is
Can I suggest we go there, then here, and then the last 2 here? Please go ahead.
Sure. You're right. Good evening.
Sorry,
everyone.
the light's on my face, so I can't see you.
Not an issue. It's about hearing. So first of all, thank you so much for this enlightening session. Sir, my question deals with the unorganized sector of our private economy. Sir, most of the businesses which we have right now in the private sector are not regulated. They are unorganized. To give an example, my father has a business of construction material. Recently, I asked him to have a website of his own, or an application of his own, to which he said कि अपने market में ऐसा innovation नहीं चलता है, और we won't get the real market share, or we won't approach the people who are in need of all of this. Sir, how do we include these small business owners into this inclusive growth pattern? How do we connect them to this supply chain? How do we change the mindset of these traditional business owners which is existing?
Shinjini?
Alok has a report which we are talking about. There's a whole section on ONDC, which I think you should read and maybe, talk to your father about it. And I want to also take Vibhav's point on that. That's exactly the institutional mechanism that we are talking about. So we obviously have a whole layer of entrepreneurship that is of the kind that you are talking about or the kind that I'm talking about. And there is, of course, the government and the policy, but there is a need for that institutional mechanism for all of it to become stable and sustainable and, go long term. So that, I think, is... Read the chapter. Which is the chapter?
No, there is just a quick point on construction materials. If you are to use the digital commerce network, you can do it without paying 20% that you currently do to a normal platform. So it's only when your father sees that there's an expanded market possible, will he see this. He's not going to do this for a website. It has to be because these mechanisms are enabling an expansion of the market, which is what we are seeing, particularly in building and construction materials. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ankit Bhuktani, and one of the area I passionately work is within the space of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I do that by talking to my clients' companies and sell them the ideas of DEI, not from the philanthropic side, but saying that, hey, by having more DEI operations, it's good ROI, right? So Hemant, just to comment on one of the statement you made that when society evolves, a company follows, right? But I think you're giving little less credit to the company. I want to talk about like Indian Desi company like Mahindra's and Godrej talked about diversity, equity, inclusion very passionately, very openly, even before when the 377 was still the reality in India, right? Before the Supreme Court judgment of 2018. So I have a great hope, and I look towards corporates saying that, hey, I mean, they can also lead the change. Currently, we are talking about marriage equality in the Supreme Court, but there are companies, again, Indian Desi companies recognize same-gender partners in their insurance policy. I'll end by one very positive success story. One of my client having over 5,000 employees, financial company having 5,000 employee plus across India, in Mumbai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Gurugram, were looking at expanding the DI operations. So they said, Ankit, we did everything internal fine, we have policy done, we are making sure that we have a proper DI policies and procedures in place, but what do we do next? They said, hey, why don't we look into your supply chain? One of the first supply chain client we came across was their insurance service provider. Does your insurance service provider recognize same-gender partners under the DEI umbrella which you are talking about? They said, okay, they don't do it, but can you just check? We checked with them and said, okay, hey, we are giving you 5,000 plus employees insurance. If you're not recognizing this, would you be open to it? If not, because there are other companies who are ready to recognize that, right? And that way, this particular company was able to change their supply chain to be more sensitive towards DEI conversations, right? So I think a company can do beyond the moving, like, looking towards this without looking at the society or without looking at the state to force them to change, wherein that they be the enabler or the change maker themselves. And many companies, and deliberately I'm not talking any foreign company name. These are the example coming from the Desi company who have done it. So I think we are moving in towards that right direction of inclusion, especially from the LGBT inclusion perspective. Of course, there's much needs to be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Ankit. That's really inspiring. Last two questions, please. The lady in the middle, please.
Yeah. Hello, respected panel. I'm Debanjali from SDA Bokkani Asia Center, Powai. So, sir, my question is, you talked about, the share of labor dominating over the capital in the coming millennia. So, sir, historically, is that labor is subjected to more of a decreasing returns of scale. That's how, sir, I'm an economics student, so that's how, it's the capital that won over us. Finally, at the end of the day. So, sir, how do you, there are inherent issues with labor, like unlike machine, humans do complain, there are syndicates, and also more among the blue collar workers, so definitely white collars won't do, but also they do face some difficulties. So, sir, how do you, I would like to ponder, sir, what is your suggestion for, having the human dominance on the same?
No, thank you. Your question, like Jamal's question, is the quintessential challenge that is facing the world, that the pendulum swung too much in favor of capital. How do you bring a more equitable balance, but without it being distortionary? I think part of, I laid out some things in response to Jamal. Maybe I missed a couple of other things, Jamal. One is that we're in a world of such rapid technological change that you're going to see a lot of sunset industries, sunrise industries, and policymakers' job is to ensure that capital and labor can quickly move from one sector to another. And it also means having, Alok pointed to this, a robust safety net for people who are left behind, which around the world wasn't done very well. Let me just end by saying this. If you just step back, I think this comes down to what is the role of the public sector versus the private sector. And I would say that the public sector's, given that state capacity is quite limited, the public sector's job is to just focus on either public goods or to focus on where there are acute market failures. But we should have a pretty high bar for saying only if these things are met do we want the public sector to expend capital on it. And I think in the context of India, we're slowly getting there, right? If you think of the last 10 years, there's been a big push, especially the last 5 years, on infrastructure, right? And that's going to has begun to create a lot of construction jobs. That is a public good. That is what the government can do. It's pushing hard on it. We finally have the healthiest private sector, banking sector balance sheets in a decade. How did that happen? Because we finally had a bankruptcy law, and talking about institutional mechanisms, over 8, 9, 10 years, balance sheets got cleaner and credit has begun to flow again. So part of this comes down to ensuring that the price of capital and labor is not misaligned. Part of this is recognizing that the public sector become the catalyst or the enabling mechanism for the private sector to invest and to create jobs. I'll just end with one part that's not appreciated very much, is the importance of what we call macroeconomic stability. This is the 10th anniversary of the taper tantrum. 10 years ago in 2013, the rupee was the worst performing currency in the emerging market world, and we were called a part of the fragile 5 economies. Last year, we had the most aggressive monetary tightening in 40 years around the world, right? And nobody flinched. There was no talk about any vulnerability in India's point, right? We took this, just kind of brushed this off. And the point is because over the last 10 years, again, there have been institutional mechanisms to protect and preserve macroeconomic stability. We have an inflation targeting framework. Inflation was 10% in 2012-13. It's averaged 5% in the last 10 years. Our foreign currency reserves were 280 billion in 2013. They touched almost 700 billion in 2022. So, I'll just end by saying there are no easy answers. This is a difficult problem, but part of this is recognizing it's the vibrancy of the private sector and the entrepreneurial spirit that everyone's spoken about that ultimately creates jobs and rewards labor. The challenge is to identify what is the enabling, catalyzing role of the public sector to let the private sector flourish and create those jobs. And I think, I'm not sure around the world over the last 10 or 15 years, we got this division of labor right.
Okay, last question from the lady in blue right there. She's been waiting. Sorry, the lady in blue's been waiting.
Yeah, she just handed over a mic to me.
Okay.
So first of all, I would like to thank the entire panel for a lovely discussion. This question is open to everybody. I am raising a voice from educational institutions' point of view. We have discussed that students need to be skilled to get into the industries. But with the rapidly changing industry landscape, traditional education institutions fail to equip these students with the necessary skills. Now, how can these industries come forward and let the students know what to work upon? And how can they actually create more jobs for the freshers? Because I don't want my graduates to be ending up with a blue-collar job.
This is a classical problem again to solve for, because you are absolutely right. I mean, the way the curriculum is shaping up is very different to what the needs of the industry are. But let me tell you what we do. Generally, we have very active engagement with several educational institutions right now as part of a project EVEN, which is the work that we are doing to empower 1 million women. We have engaged with 2,000 educational institutions across the country with the same aim that please don't churn out graduates which are not employable, but churn out skills, people with skills, so that they can find a job. So that's a very clear thing that we are doing. So like these kind of participation, being able to then influence the institutes to look at curriculum which is more relevant for the industry, we keep sharing that kind of information also. So this is an ongoing process. I think we need to do more, clearly. But some of the corporates clearly have a lead where we participate very actively.
Yeah, if I can just sort of add to that, and it's a word of caution since you are from an educational institution, right? With all due respect, industry is famously short-sighted, right? So if they need, for example, turners and fitters, and they see that need for the next 2 years, that's something that they'd probably tell us as education to say, hey, let's have more and more of that. I think the role of education, what is ultimately valued, what has lasting value? You and I come with a set of core critical thinking ability, problem-solving skills, decision-making skills, the ability to synthesize. Those are core to foundational, sort of education. I don't think we should be losing that. And I think the part of the problem is also that even if you go to a lot of the MBA schools, local MBA schools, the accent more is on presentation and networks and things like that, but not these core skills. I do believe that if we go back to the basics, industry will find all of our students really valuable because they can adapt to what is changing today. So I'd sort of give you the other side of
Can I want to challenge one thing here, if I may? I want to be very careful that we are not in this old mindset of white collar and blue collar and saying blue collar doesn't matter. The most valuable technology-led roles in manufacturing, which will pay the most, are not the peons and clerks who are pushing paper. It is actually the people who are managing modern manufacturing plants, who understand how to use technology, supervisors who know how to read the sensors and drive a lot of value from that. So I do think in our cities, in our education, right, you talk about the apprenticeship program, to celebrate that, and that's one of the reasons that we talked about, Inakshi mentioned it up front, this is about per capita income. And if you say, where am I going to get that 50, 60,000 rupee job, right, that's going to come, Hemant, in one of your plants, where someone is actually managing a line, assembly line, much more so than someone who's just pushing paper in an office, right? So I just want to be clear that our mindset should not be, I don't want someone to be a blue-collar job. It's just how do we build the skills so that someone can have a sustained income with dignity and respect. Now, just to quickly finish up this conversation and then we'll hand to Inakshi, I just want to say firstly a huge thank you to all of you. I think it's been a very rich and incredible discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much. And maybe just 3 quick points to observe. It can be India's century. It can be. It won't be if we don't act on our challenges of inequality, of climate change, and the need to work in deep partnerships between the private and the public sector. If we do this, we will be able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into empowerment. We will be the beacon for the world in providing skills and jobs, and we will be really someone and countries that everyone admires and respects. And that's how we can be India's century if we all put our mind to it. Thank you.